In the last lecture module, we discussed how arguments are artifacts, and specifically how arguments are structured collections of statements that serve to model potential inferences. Now, you might think, well, that's a very interesting characterization of arguments, and they might seem fairly useful to us under that characterization, but why are you getting so teary-eyed about the prevalence and importance of artifacts? Why would anyone come up with multiple sciences to study how best to formulate and evaluate arguments? I think it behooves us to take just a moment to think about the different ways in which artifacts play a crucial role, both in our communication and in our culture. To start, arguments provide a method for us to present our thinking, either to ourselves in the current moment, future, or to others. And they do so in a way that maximizes that comprehensibility and impactfulness that we want in our thinking. Secondly, arguments persuade others. Arguments are convincing to people, and they also have a normative force. That is, they're also compelling from a normative or authoritative perspective, as we'll see. Arguments allow us to preserve a line of thought for ourselves, for others, for future generations, and this turns out to be really also an important feature of arguments. And finally, arguments allow us to encode our potential inferences in a manner that allows us to go back and look at them and analyze and refine our thinking, fine-tune, criticize, evaluate our thought. And this turns out to be incredibly important. So verbal and written arguments facilitate presentation and persuasion in two ways. First, arguments organize information in a manner that minimizes the challenges posed by human limitations in the processing of large and complex bodies of information. And specifically, arguments organize information to provide a model or a roadmap for inferences. That is, they model a relationship between evidence and a conclusion that one might draw from that evidence. Verbal and written arguments also serve to facilitate presentation and persuasion in a second fashion by explicitly identifying inferences and formalizing them. Arguments gain the normative force of the associated formal system. As we'll see during the course of the term, these formal systems lay out objective and demonstrable relationships between the truth of the premises of the argument and the truth or likely truth of the conclusion. And because they are objective and because they are demonstrable, they have this strong normative force. That is, they represent what are judged to be legitimate patterns of reasoning, the violation of which is judged to be illegitimate. So, for example, suppose I present to you an argument something like this: all dogs are mammals, Calvin is a dog, therefore Calvin is a mammal. And you were to respond to me by saying, I see that this is a valid argument. That is, if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. And I see that the premises are true. I recognize that all dogs are mammals. I see your dog Calvin there, obviously a dog. However, I reject the conclusion that Calvin is a mammal. Now, that violation of an objective and demonstrable relationship between what you accept as the truth of the premises and what you deny, the truth of the conclusion, that violates a norm. That violates a principle of good reasoning that is objective and demonstrable, and hence my response, the average person's response, would be to say, you're not being reasonable, you're not being rational, you are violating the normal rules of how to go about reasoning well. And importantly, if someone were to adopt that stance toward the conclusion of a demonstrably valid argument with true premises, they're betraying their own vested interest in believing likely truths, and they are sacrificing their credibility. People don't need to take their views on that issue seriously. Arguments are also vehicles of preservation and evaluation, and these are incredibly important aspects of arguments as well. Written arguments especially serve a vital function in that they transfer information from our brain to an external long-term memory, like a piece of paper or an electronic data storage device. This transfer allows for greater permanence for the modeled inferences, facilitating their preservation. So you can go to the library, you can't actually right now, but in normal times, you can go to the library, go to the philosophy section, pull a copy of Plato's Republic down, and see right there, transcribed on that paper, a copy of Plato's modeled inferences, say, regarding the tripartite nature of the soul. This transfer also lightens cognitive load. It allows humans to free up their very limited, very small working memory capacity in order to better formulate and evaluate that argument. So working with paper and pencil, working on your computer, that allows you to transfer some of that information into an external memory base and then allows you to operate on it without draining all of your working memory resources. And so we see that it's because arguments facilitate presentation, persuasion, preservation, revision, and evaluation that they prove so useful in constructive and information-driven interactions between human beings. And that is why we find multiple sciences being devoted to studying logical arguments and how to better create and evaluate them. So, for example, formal logic, the logics of deductive arguments, they all study an important aspect of arguments that we don't normally consider and we're not particularly good at evaluating or even recognizing. Logic, that is, formal, deductive logics, study logical form, the underlying structural relationships between content elements independent of the actual content of the argument. And this traces back all the way to Aristotle, to ancient Greece. Aristotle was possibly the first person to recognize and to exploit the fact that arguments have two important components. They have their content, the truth or falsity of their premises, and they have their underlying logical structure, the relationships that the arguments put that content into so as to establish a new relationship with a conclusion. Now you might be thinking, I'm out now. But it's really not as scary or difficult as you might first suppose. For instance, consider the following argument. France has a larger landmass than Canada. The country with the larger landmass has a better hockey team. Hence, France has a better hockey team than Canada. Now, this is an argument I used to bait my Canadian students with when I taught at the University of British Columbia. This argument is bad. It's objectively bad. But there's something good about this argument as well, despite the protestations of my Canadian students. And we can see what's good about the argument by considering a different version of that argument, a version with different content, but the same underlying logical form, the same underlying structural relationship between content elements. Canada has a larger landmass than France. The country with the larger landmass has more square miles. Hence, Canada has more square miles than France. Canadians, U.S. citizens, we recognize this as a good argument. If the premises are true, then the conclusion has to be true. Good argument. But the underlying structural relationships between the content elements in this second argument are the same as the underlying structural relationships between the content elements of the first argument. So that if it were true that France has a larger landmass than Canada, which it isn't, and if it were also true that somehow the country with the larger landmass has the better hockey team, if those two things were true, then it would also be true necessarily that France had a better hockey team than Canada. So the truth of the premises in this argument guarantee the truth of the conclusion. And they do so not because of the content of the argument, but because of the underlying structural relationships between content elements that shared between both the first and the second versions of this argument.